James Madison's notes on the 1787 Constitutional Convention is among the most important artifacts of United States history, and it's one of the most underutilized. If it were up to me, every student in the nation would go through an entire course on just this document. Doing so would provide a better understanding of how much diversity of opinion there was among the framers, provide more context to some of the arguments around different compromises agreed to at the convention, shed light on some of the ideas that were up for debate, some of which would be considered completely outlandish today, and maybe most importantly, remove the need to have anyone tell you what the framers intended. Instead, you could simply read their debates and refer to them when questions around their intent arise. Some of the framers supported a unicameral legislature, if not simply copying the British Parliament, but from the beginning of the convention, there was majority support for two branches in the national legislature, one democratic and one aristocratic. In other words, one of the common people and one of the high classes. That's not my commentary, by the way. Aristocratic wasn't as pejorative back then as it is today. A government based on social standing and wealth was radical relative to a monarchy. In fact, Pierce Butler, a framer from South Carolina and one of the largest slaveholders in the country who later became a senator, is quoted as saying during the convention about the Senate, quote, "This second branch I consider as the aristocratic part of our government," end quote. They were very open about this. Which makes sense, by the way. Most of the men in this room were aristocrats. George Washington, for example, was worth $707 million inflation-adjusted dollars when he died. James Madison, who will be crucial in this conversation, was worth $136 million. We've romanticized the framers to such an extent that it's easy to forget that most of them were fundamentally elitist. Most of them didn't think that common people were capable of self-government. Most of them supported chattel slavery, after all. At times, they would pretend that aristocrats merely needed to protect the common people from themselves, but the true concerns were always there. Governor Morris, a framer from Pennsylvania who inherited great wealth from his family that owned a bunch of land in what is now New York City, is quoted as saying, quote, "The second branch ought to be composed of men of great and established property, an aristocracy, men who from pride will support consistency and permanency. Such an aristocratic body will keep down the turbulence of democracy," end quote. In other words, men that are wealthy enough to be incentivized to preserve the status quo. James Madison was more explicit about this concern, saying, quote, "The man who is possessed of wealth, who lolls on his sofa or rolls in his carriage, cannot judge the wants or feelings of the day laborer. The government we mean to erect is intended to last for ages. The landed interest at present is prevalent, but in the process of time, when we approximate to the states and kingdoms of Europe, when the number of landholders shall be comparatively small through the various means of trade and manufactures, will not the landed interest be overbalanced in future elections? And unless wisely provided against, what will become of your government? In England at this day, if elections were open to all classes of people, the property of the landed proprietors would be insecure. An agrarian law would soon take place," end quote. What would become of your government, he asked to a room of aristocrats. Madison thought the government, state governments included, was owed to the aristocracy. In other words, Madison knew that they were creating a system wherein concentrated wealth would only become more concentrated over time, and if given the power to do so, common people would eventually even the scales. He and others opined that common people couldn't be trusted to do this without burning everything down in the process, which is pretty convenient when you're trying to justify subjugation. However, Morris at least had the decency to acknowledge that, quote, "Men of large property will uniformly endeavor to establish tyranny. This lust for power will ever be checked by the democratic branch, and thus form a stability in your government," end quote. Insofar as the bicameral legislature was created as a check, it was a check against aristocrats becoming despots, not against democracy, like so many people like to pretend today. As you read through these debates, it quickly becomes clear that the framers were referring to the moneyed interests that filled state governments and wrote state constitutions when they mentioned states. They didn't anthropomorphize states like some of us do today and pretend that they're corporeal entities. That would have been silly, just as it is today. They weren't talking about states protecting themselves from each other or anything like that. That doesn't even really make sense if you think about it carefully. California has the most House seats and they still only account for 12% of the body as a whole. Even if every California representative voted in lockstep with each other, you're not exactly going to achieve legislative tyranny with 12% of the vote. It also wasn't to create balance. It quite literally creates an imbalance by granting the aristocracy a disproportionate amount of power for the explicit purpose of maintaining dominance over common people. They were talking about aristocracies within a state being on even ground with aristocracies of other states within the national legislature. The lower house being democratic was a bone thrown to the common people, which you can tell in how little power it has compared to every other body in government. This opinion wasn't uniform though. James Wilson, a framer from Pennsylvania who went on to sit on the first Supreme Court and teach the first collegiate course on the Constitution to George Washington and his cabinet no less, argued that legislators should be apportioned based on population, that the right to vote should be extended to all legal citizens, and that those votes should be counted equally for all offices, legislative and executive. He said about Congress that the, quote, national legislative powers ought to flow immediately from the people so as to contain all their understanding and be an exact transcript of their minds. He observed that the people had already parted with as much of their power as was necessary to form on its basis a perfect government, and the particular states must part with such a portion of it as to make the present national government adequate to their own peace and security of their liberties, end quote. In other words, if aristocrats have more liberty than common people, then the liberties of common people aren't secure. Later he says, quote, every citizen of one state possesses the same rights with the citizen of another. The state who has 5 times the number of inhabitants ought, nay must, have the same proportion of weight in the representation. The Declaration of Independence preceded the state constitutions. What does this declare? In the name of the people of these states, we are to be declared free and independent, end quote. In other words, states are free and independent only insofar as their inhabitants are free and independent, which they aren't if they're subservient to the aristocracy. Madison's rebuttal was, quote, the government ought to be constituted as to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. The Senate therefore ought to be this body, and to answer these purposes they ought to have permanency and stability, end quote. I'm sure you've heard some version of this before. Opponents of pluralistic democracy often cite this while pretending that Madison was referring to persecuted minorities. In fact, he says opulent minority, meaning now, as it did then, wealthy. The minority Madison referred to wasn't a political minority or a minority political party or demographic minorities. It was the aristocracy. The Senate was explicitly designed to protect the interests of wealthy people against the encroachment of everyone else. And in so doing, the Senate grants the aristocracy superior representation and political power to everyone else. The Senate's design is a result of the majority of the framers thinking that rich people are better and deserve more rights and liberties than common people. I'm of the opinion that Wilson's argument better aligned with the principles that the United States was purportedly erected to promote as described by the Declaration of Independence. He and those that agreed with him compromised not because the opposing ideas were better, but because they were larger in numbers. And they were larger in numbers not because they were better, but because the Constitutional Convention was attended mostly by aristocrats, and the common person was scarcely represented. Madison did indeed think that democracy was a threat, but not to liberty or freedom. He thought it was a threat to aristocracy. He wasn't shy about it, and he was right. Democracies are a threat to aristocracies because aristocrats don't deserve more liberty than common people. As Wilson said, every citizen of one state possesses the same rights as its citizens of another. Nowadays, it's very convenient for people who want to maintain the aristocracy to tell people who live in low population states if everyone's vote counted equal and if everyone had equal representation, California and New York would run the country, and just hope that you never do the math on that claim. But the Senate screws over Americans who live in rural California the same as it does people in urban Oklahoma, the same as it does as people in suburban Ohio, by concentrating power among the aristocracy. Today, when common people defend the mechanisms of aristocracy put in place by Madison and the other aristocrats at the convention like the Senate, they defend Madison's opulent minority. They're protecting the elites, the aristocrats, at the expense of common people, and in so doing, diminishing our standing in our society.